I was lying in a hospital bed just days after heart surgery, staring at my phone and realizing my own son had stopped answering my calls. I had spent my entire life sacrificing everything for him, believing family would always be there when it mattered most. But as the hours passed and the silence grew heavier, a stranger stepped into my room and said 7 words that would change everything. I never forgot what you did for me. Before we dive into today's story, take a moment to share where you're tuning in from. We love seeing how our stories connect people from all around the world. Your comments and thoughts bring this community to life, and we're so grateful to have you on this journey with us. If you haven't already, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story. Now, grab a cozy seat, maybe a cup of coffee or tea, and prepare yourself for a tale that will captivate your heart from beginning to end. Let's begin. My name is Evelyn Harper, and I was 66 years old when my life began to unravel in ways I never could have imagined. I lived alone in a modest house on the outskirts of Asheville, North Carolina, a place surrounded by rolling hills, old oak trees, and enough quiet to make a person hear their own thoughts. Most mornings followed the same comforting rhythm. I would wake before sunrise, make a cup of coffee, and sit on the back porch watching the mist drift across the mountains. After 40 years of teaching elementary school children, retirement felt slower than I had expected, but not unhappy. The house was small, but it carried an entire lifetime inside its walls. Photographs lined the hallway. Old report cards sat tucked away in drawers. A faded baseball glove still rested on a shelf in the garage. Everywhere I looked, there were reminders of my husband Michael and our son Ryan. Michael had died 27 years earlier in a construction accident. One ordinary morning, he had left for work. He never came home. The loss shattered me. For months, I moved through life like a shadow, barely able to breathe beneath the weight of grief. But I had a 10-year-old boy depending on me, and that responsibility became the reason I got out of bed every day. I became mother and father at the same time. I taught during the day. I tutored students after school. I worked summer programs whenever they were available. There were years when I barely slept, and even more years when I worried constantly about money. Still, Ryan never knew how difficult things truly were. When college tuition arrived, I sold my wedding ring. When he needed a computer, I canceled the first vacation I had planned in more than a decade. When opportunities appeared, I found a way to pay for them, even when I could not afford groceries for myself. None of it felt like sacrifice at the time. It felt like love. And for many years, it seemed worth it. Ryan graduated from college with honors. He built a successful financial consulting company in Charlotte. He married a beautiful woman named Vanessa. They bought a large home in an upscale neighborhood and seemed to have everything I had hoped for him. Whenever someone mentioned his accomplishments, pride filled my chest. That pride remained even as something slowly began to change. The visits became less frequent. The phone calls became shorter. Holiday gatherings felt rushed. There was always another meeting, another business trip, another obligation demanding Ryan's attention. Vanessa often handled schedules and plans. Most invitations came through her rather than him. Whenever friends asked if it bothered me, I always gave the same answer. Ryan is busy. Successful people have demanding lives. I believed those explanations because the alternative hurt too much. The truth was that loneliness had quietly settled into my life, not overwhelming loneliness, just a steady ache that appeared whenever I looked at an empty chair across the dinner table or waited for a phone call that never came. Still, I never complained. I had spent my entire life being Ryan's mother. That role defined me more than any career or accomplishment ever could. As long as he was happy, I convinced myself that everything had turned out exactly as it should. One rainy afternoon, I was sorting through an old box of family photographs in the living room when a sharp pain suddenly spread across my chest. It lasted only a few seconds, long enough to make me stop breathing, long enough to make me grip the edge of the table. Then it disappeared. I sat quietly, staring at a photograph of Ryan at age 12, smiling beside a birthday cake. After a moment, I laughed softly and shook my head. Probably indigestion, probably stress, probably nothing at all. I put the photographs away and continued with my day. At the time, I had no idea that small moment would change everything. After the pain in my chest passed that rainy afternoon, I convinced myself it was nothing serious. At 66, little aches and discomforts seemed to arrive without invitation. I told myself that growing older meant accepting certain inconveniences and learning not to worry about every symptom. For a while, that explanation was enough. But over the following weeks, the pain returned. At first, it appeared only occasionally. A brief tightness while carrying groceries from my car. A strange pressure when I bent down to pull weeds from the flower beds behind my house. Then came the shortness of breath. Simple tasks became more difficult. One morning, I found myself stopping halfway up the staircase, gripping the railing while I waited for my breathing to steady. Another afternoon, I came dizzy while watering my roses. I stood motionless in the yard for several minutes until the spinning sensation finally faded. Even then, I told no one. Independence had become a habit after so many years alone. I did not like asking for help. More importantly, I did not want Ryan worrying about me. At least that was what I told myself. Deep down, another truth existed. I was afraid he would not come. The symptoms continued to worsen. By early spring, exhaustion followed me everywhere. Activities that once brought me joy now left me drained. Church services felt longer. Volunteer work became more difficult. Some evenings I fell asleep in my chair before finishing dinner. Then came the Saturday that changed everything. I was shopping at a grocery store near downtown Asheville. The store was busy with weekend customers pushing carts through crowded aisles. I remember standing near the dairy section comparing prices on yogurt when a crushing pain exploded across my chest. The world suddenly tilted. My vision blurred. The carton slipped from my hand and struck the floor. For a moment I tried to steady myself. Then everything went dark. When I opened my eyes again, bright lights hung above me. Strange voices echoed nearby. A paramedic was speaking while another adjusted equipment beside a stretcher. An ambulance siren wailed in the distance. Fear settled into my stomach. Something was terribly wrong. The hospital moved quickly. Doctors ordered blood tests, scans, and cardiac examinations. Nurses came and went carrying charts and medications. Hours passed in a blur of fluorescent lights and medical terminology. Late that evening, a cardiologist entered my room. The expression on his face told me the news before he spoke. My heart valve had suffered significant damage. Surgery would be necessary. Soon. Waiting too long could place my life in serious danger. After he left, I sat alone staring at the wall. For the first time since Michael died, I felt truly frightened. Not of pain. Not of hospitals. Of dying. I reached for my phone. If there was ever a moment when family should come together, surely this was it. I called Ryan. No answer. I waited 20 minutes and called again. No answer. The third call went directly to voicemail. Hours later, my phone vibrated. Relief flooded through me. But it was not Ryan. It was Vanessa. Her message explained that Ryan was meeting with potential investors and could not be interrupted. She said he would contact me when his schedule allowed. I stared at the screen for a long time. A small part of me felt wounded. Another part immediately rushed to defend him. Important meetings happened. Businesses required attention. He probably did not understand how serious the situation was. That had to be the explanation. Outside my room, families gathered around other patients. I could hear conversations, laughter, and comforting voices drifting through the hallway. My room remained quiet. As darkness settled beyond the hospital window, a nurse brought surgical consent forms for me to sign. I signed every page alone. Then I placed my phone beside the bed and waited for my son's call. The phone remained silent as night fell outside my hospital window. That night felt longer than any night I could remember. After signing the surgical consent forms, I placed my phone on the small table beside my hospital bed and waited for Ryan to call. Every few minutes, I glanced at the screen, expecting to see his name appear. I imagined him finally reading Vanessa's message, realizing how serious my condition was, and rushing to contact me. The call never came. Hours passed. The hallway lights dimmed. Nurses moved quietly from room to room. Somewhere down the corridor, a television played softly behind a closed door. I barely slept. Each time I woke, my eyes immediately searched for my phone. The screen remained dark. By morning, exhaustion settled deep into my bones. The nurses arrived before sunrise to prepare me for surgery. They checked my vital signs, reviewed paperwork, and explained the procedure once more. Everyone was kind, professional, and reassuring. Yet beneath their smiles, I sensed the efficiency of people who had done this thousands of times before. As they wheeled me through the cardiac wing, I noticed something that made my chest ache even more than my failing heart. Families, everywhere. A husband sat beside his wife's bed holding her hand. 2 adult daughters stood outside another room discussing medications with a doctor. A grandson carried balloons toward an elderly patient waiting for surgery. No one walked beside my stretcher. No one asked questions about my condition. No one whispered words of encouragement before the operating room doors opened. I was completely alone. As the ceiling lights passed overhead, memories surfaced without warning. Ryan's first day of kindergarten, his nervous smile before a middle school talent show, the tears in his eyes when he received his college acceptance letter. For years, every major decision in my life had revolved around him. Lying there, I found myself asking a painful question. Had I somehow failed him? The thought lasted only seconds before I pushed it away. Parents always blame themselves first. That was what I was doing. The operating room was colder than I expected. Machines surrounded me from every direction. Doctors and nurses moved with calm precision. I said a silent prayer and took one final look at my phone before the anesthesia pulled me under. Then everything disappeared. When I opened my eyes again, the world felt distant and unfamiliar. My chest burned. My throat felt raw. Machines beeped around me. For several minutes, I struggled to understand where I was. Then the memories returned. The hospital, the surgery, the damaged heart valve. I had survived. The following days passed in a haze of medication, discomfort, and exhaustion. Every movement hurt. Even breathing required effort. Yet the emotional pain slowly became worse than the physical recovery. Visitors came and went throughout the cardiac unit. Fresh flowers appeared on bedside tables. Children hugged grandparents. Spouses brought homemade meals and magazines. Every afternoon, I watched families gather around patients who looked no healthier than I was. My room remained empty. On the second day after surgery, my phone vibrated. My heart immediately lifted. Ryan. At last. I opened the message. It contained only a few words. A brief wish for a speedy recovery. Nothing more. No apology. No promise to visit. No indication that he planned to come. I stared at the screen for several minutes before setting the phone aside. Even then, I defended him. He was busy. Work was demanding. There had to be an explanation. But somewhere deep inside me, a painful truth was beginning to take shape. Maybe Ryan simply was not coming. By the third day, one of the nurses, Karen, had clearly noticed that nobody ever visited my room. She was warm, observant, and far too experienced to miss signs of loneliness. That afternoon, she reviewed my chart while discussing discharge plans. Then she asked a simple question: who would be taking me home? For several seconds, I could not answer. I looked at the phone resting beside my bed. For the first time, I realized I had absolutely no idea. I remained silent after Nurse Karen asked who would be taking me home. The question seemed simple enough, yet I could not answer it. For 3 days, I had convinced myself that Ryan would eventually call, eventually visit, eventually do what sons were supposed to do when their mothers were recovering from heart surgery. Now, sitting in that hospital bed with discharge paperwork waiting nearby, I was being forced to confront a possibility I had spent days avoiding. Maybe he was not coming. Karen must have noticed the panic behind my expression. She pulled a chair closer and patiently explained what recovery would involve. Patients who had undergone major heart surgery were not supposed to return home alone. Someone needed to monitor medications, help with meals, watch for complications, and assist with everyday tasks. Hospital policy required a reasonable recovery plan. I immediately insisted I would be fine. I told her I lived independently. I told her I could call a taxi. I told her I had managed difficult situations my entire life. What I did not tell her was that I was terrified. Even standing up made me dizzy. My chest felt tight and fragile. The thought of returning to an empty house with nobody nearby filled me with a fear I had never experienced before. Karen listened without arguing. Her expression revealed she was unconvinced. Before leaving, she promised to discuss the situation with the medical team. The rest of the afternoon passed slowly. Through the doorway, I watched other patients leave with their families. Husbands carried bags. Daughters pushed wheelchairs. Grandchildren hugged recovering grandparents. Each departure made my room feel a little emptier. By evening, the truth had become impossible to ignore. Ryan had not called. Ryan had not visited. Ryan had not even asked how the surgery went. I was staring out the window when another visitor entered my room. The staff immediately seemed to straighten when they saw him. He carried himself with calm confidence, the kind that comes from decades of experience. His silver hair and steady gaze made him appear distinguished without seeming intimidating. I recognized him immediately. Dr. William Bennett, the surgeon who had repaired my heart. He greeted me warmly and reviewed my chart before taking a seat nearby. At first, the conversation focused on my recovery. He asked about pain levels, mobility, and medications. Then the questions became more personal. He asked where I lived, whether I had family nearby, whether I had spent most of my life in Asheville. Then he asked something unexpected. Had I been an elementary school teacher during the 1980s? The question caught me off guard. A few moments later, he asked whether I remembered helping a struggling college student many years ago. I searched my memory but found nothing specific. Throughout my teaching career, I had helped countless young people. William smiled softly. Then he began telling me a story. 40 years earlier, he had arrived in Asheville as a medical student with almost no money. He worked long hours while trying to complete his education. Eventually, he fell behind on rent and faced losing the small room he was renting. According to him, a young teacher named Evelyn Harper had stepped in. She had helped him find temporary housing. She had quietly contributed money toward his rent. Most importantly, she had encouraged him when he was considering abandoning medical school entirely. As he spoke, fragments of memory slowly returned. A frightened young student, a difficult winter, a few small acts of kindness that had seemed insignificant at the time. To him, they had meant everything. His voice became softer. I never forgot what you did. The words settled heavily in the room. I barely remembered helping him, yet he remembered every detail for decades. William explained that he had often wondered whether he would ever have an opportunity to repay that kindness. Now, unexpectedly, life had provided one. He owned a large estate outside Asheville and employed professional nursing staff. He offered me a private guest suite and full recovery support until I was healthy enough to live independently again. My first instinct was to refuse. Pride had always been one of my greatest weaknesses. Accepting help felt uncomfortable. Accepting help from a stranger felt impossible. But William gently explained that this was not charity, it was gratitude. And for the first time, I allowed myself to admit the truth. I had nowhere else to go. The next morning, discharge arrangements were finalized. As I left the hospital beside the man whose life I had unknowingly changed 40 years earlier, I found myself wondering why a stranger remembered my kindness better than my own son remembered my love. Leaving the hospital with William Bennett felt strangely unreal. Only a few days earlier, I had been preparing myself to recover alone in my small house. Instead, I found myself being driven through the rolling hills outside Asheville toward an estate that looked as though it belonged in a magazine. The property was beautiful without being extravagant. Tall trees surrounded the grounds, and large windows overlooked the mountains. Everything felt peaceful, carefully maintained, and welcoming. Most importantly, I felt safe. A private nurse helped manage my medications. Nutritious meals appeared on schedule. Daily checkups ensured my recovery stayed on track. For the first time since my surgery, I could focus on healing instead of worrying about survival. As the days passed, my strength slowly returned. Short walks became easier. Breathing became less painful. The constant exhaustion began to fade. During those quiet weeks, William and I spent many evenings talking. He told me stories about his years as a surgeon, the patients he never forgot, and the wife he had lost several years earlier. I shared memories of Michael, my years in the classroom, and the challenges of raising Ryan alone. Both of us understood loneliness. Both of us understood grief. Somewhere between breakfast conversations and evening walks through the gardens, a genuine friendship began to form. Then 2 weeks after my surgery, everything changed. My telephone rang. Ryan. For a moment, my heart nearly stopped. I had not heard his voice since before the operation. His tone sounded surprisingly warm. He asked about my health, my recovery, and whether I was feeling better. More importantly, he wanted to visit immediately. The call left me with mixed emotions. Part of me felt relieved. Part of me felt hopeful. But another part felt strangely uneasy. The timing seemed odd. For 2 weeks, he had shown almost no interest in my condition. Suddenly, he was eager to reconnect. When I mentioned the conversation to William, I noticed a subtle change in his expression. He remained polite, but something clearly concerned him. A few days later, I met Daniel Brooks, William's longtime attorney and trusted advisor. Daniel was thoughtful, intelligent, and remarkably observant. Though nobody said so directly, I sensed they were worried about something. At William's request, Daniel had quietly reviewed public business records connected to Ryan. The results were troubling. Ryan's financial consulting company was struggling far more than I had ever imagined. Several major clients had left. Revenue had fallen significantly. Personal debts had accumulated. The successful image Ryan projected appeared increasingly fragile. Then Daniel discovered something even more alarming. A limited liability company had been registered using my home address. My address. Not Ryan's office. Not his home. Mine. Legal notices, business correspondence, and official documents had all been directed there. Neither William nor Daniel wanted to alarm me before confirming the details, but their concern was obvious. The situation appeared serious. Meanwhile, Ryan called again. This time, many of his questions focused on William. What kind of property did he own? How long had I been staying there? Where exactly was the estate located? His curiosity felt excessive, almost calculated. I tried convincing myself that I was imagining things. After all, he was my son. Perhaps he simply wanted reassurance that I was being cared for properly, yet doubt had begun to creep into my thoughts. For the first time in my life, I found myself questioning whether Ryan's sudden concern was truly about me. Several days later, Daniel completed another round of research. The expression on his face told me the news was worse than anyone had expected. As Ryan's visit was scheduled for the following weekend, I had no idea that my son's sudden return had far less to do with love than with something he desperately needed. The morning of Ryan's visit arrived with a strange mixture of hope and anxiety. For days, I had imagined what it would feel like to see my son again. Part of me wanted to believe that everything would somehow return to normal the moment he walked through the door. Another part remembered sitting alone in a hospital room after heart surgery, staring at a silent telephone. Those two emotions battled each other all morning. William's staff prepared a simple lunch on the terrace overlooking the mountains. The setting was peaceful, almost too peaceful for what was about to happen. William remained courteous as always, but I noticed he seemed unusually attentive. Daniel Brooks was also on the property that afternoon, supposedly handling several legal matters for William. Shortly after noon, Ryan and Vanessa arrived. The moment I saw Ryan step out of the car, my heart tightened. He looked tired, older somehow. For a brief second, I saw the little boy I had spent my entire life protecting. Then Vanessa stepped beside him, and the illusion faded. Almost immediately, her attention drifted toward the estate itself. Her eyes moved across the grounds, the architecture, the gardens, and every visible sign of wealth surrounding the property. Ryan hugged me and apologized for missing my recovery. He blamed work pressures, business demands, and overwhelming responsibilities. I wanted to believe him. Every mother wants to believe her child deserves forgiveness. Yet something felt different. Throughout lunch, I noticed how often Ryan's attention shifted toward William. Questions about property ownership gradually appeared. Then questions about long-term plans. Then questions about future healthcare arrangements. Soon the conversation moved toward estate planning, asset management, and legal authority over financial matters. The discussion felt deeply uncomfortable. I had survived heart surgery only weeks earlier, yet Ryan seemed more interested in hypothetical future assets than my actual recovery. William listened patiently. When the conversation reached an awkward pause, he calmly redirected it. Daniel joined us carrying a folder. The atmosphere changed immediately. What followed felt less like a family lunch and more like an intervention. Daniel presented verified records showing that Ryan's financial consulting business was experiencing serious difficulties. Several important clients had left. Revenue had declined significantly. Outstanding debts had accumulated over time. Ryan immediately attempted to minimize the situation. He described the problems as temporary setbacks. Unfortunately, Daniel was not finished. A second set of documents appeared. Official state records, business registration forms, corporate filings, all connected to a limited liability company, a company registered using my home address, my home. I stared at the documents in disbelief. I had never authorized such an arrangement. I had never even heard of the company. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Finally, Ryan admitted that he had used my address during a difficult period for the business. He insisted it was temporary and claimed he had planned to correct everything later. The explanation did not help. The betrayal was already sitting in front of me in black and white. For months, perhaps longer, important information had been hidden from me. Trust began collapsing under the weight of that realization. William then asked the question everyone was thinking. Why had Ryan suddenly become interested in reconnecting? Ryan struggled to answer. For the first time since he arrived, genuine embarrassment appeared on his face. And for the first time since my surgery, I stopped protecting him from the truth. I told him how alone I had felt in that hospital room. I told him about the fear, the silence, the disappointment. Then I said the words that had been building inside me for weeks. You did not come back when I needed a son. You came back when you needed something. The statement seemed to strike him harder than any accusation. His expression changed immediately. The confidence disappeared. Only shame remained. A few minutes later, Ryan quietly asked whether we could speak privately. I agreed, though uncertainty filled every part of me. For the first time since my surgery, I was no longer afraid of losing my son. I was afraid of discovering who he had become. Ryan and I walked in silence toward a quiet section of William's garden. The mountains stretched across the horizon, and a gentle breeze moved through the trees, but I barely noticed any of it. My attention remained fixed on the man walking beside me, my son, the child I had spent decades loving, the man I no longer fully recognized. We sat on a wooden bench overlooking a small pond. For several moments, neither of us spoke. The silence felt heavy, weighed down by years of unspoken disappointments and recent betrayals. Strangely, I was no longer angry. The anger had burned itself out somewhere between the hospital and that lunch table. What remained was something deeper: disappointment, exhaustion. At this, I wanted answers, not excuses. Not another carefully crafted explanation, just the truth. Eventually, Ryan began talking. For the first time since arriving, he stopped trying to defend himself. The confident businessman disappeared. In his place sat a frightened man carrying the weight of his own mistakes. He admitted that his company had been struggling for far longer than anyone knew. Major clients had left unexpectedly. Several investments had failed. Revenue continued shrinking, while expenses continued growing. At first, he believed he could fix everything. Then the problems became larger. The debts became heavier. The pressure became constant. As the situation worsened, shame followed. Each time I called, he felt guilty for hiding the truth. Each missed conversation made the next one harder. Eventually, avoiding me became easier than facing me. What began as temporary avoidance slowly transformed into complete distance. Then distance became abandonment. Listening to him hurt more than I expected. Not because the explanation excused his behavior. It did not. But because I could finally see what had happened. Ryan had not disappeared because he hated me. He had disappeared because he lacked the courage to face his failures. Understanding that truth did not erase the pain. It simply changed its shape. Then he revealed something far worse. His voice grew quieter. His hands trembled slightly. The next confession seemed difficult even for him. Months earlier, Vanessa had become increasingly desperate to solve their financial problems. Without my knowledge, she had attempted to refinance a mortgage using information connected to me. My name had been included in electronic documents. My property had nearly become collateral. The bank eventually noticed irregularities during the verification process. Additional documentation was requested, triggering internal reviews that stopped the transaction before it could be completed. I felt physically ill. The company registration had already been shocking. This was different. This involved my home, my security, my future, everything I had worked for. Then came the part that hurt most. Ryan had known, not immediately, but soon afterward. He discovered what Vanessa had done and chose not to tell me. He remained silent. He protected his marriage instead of protecting his mother. That truth cut deeper than anything else. Vanessa's actions were wrong, but Ryan knew they were wrong. The little boy I raised understood honesty. He understood responsibility. He understood the difference between right and wrong, yet he chose silence. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Tears filled his eyes. The excuses were gone. The justifications were gone. Only regret remained. Finally, he asked whether our relationship could ever be repaired. I looked away toward the distant mountains. Part of me wanted to say yes immediately. Another part wanted to protect what remained of my heart. I realized then that forgiveness and trust were not the same thing. Forgiveness might come. Trust would have to be rebuilt. Slowly, through actions, not promises, not apologies. When I finally looked back at him, I saw genuine remorse for the first time. As I stared into my son's tear-filled eyes, I realized that rebuilding a broken heart might be even harder than repairing the one surgeons had already saved. That evening, after my conversation with Ryan, I walked alone through William's estate. The sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and orange. Normally, I would have stopped to admire the view, but my thoughts were elsewhere. I kept replaying everything Ryan had confessed. The lies, the debts, the company registration, Vanessa's attempt to use my home without permission. Most of all, his silence. For years, I had believed that loving my son meant protecting him from consequences. Looking back, I realized that every time I excused bad behavior, every time I ignored warning signs, I had helped create the situation we were now facing. Love without boundaries was not always kindness. Sometimes it was permission. Later that evening, I sat with William on the terrace. He listened patiently as I shared my fears and doubts. He never criticized Ryan. He never encouraged revenge. Instead, he spoke about the families he had seen throughout his career. Many relationships survived painful mistakes. Others did not. The difference often came down to accountability. Forgiveness, he explained, did not mean pretending nothing happened. Real forgiveness required honesty, responsibility, and change. The following morning, Daniel Brooks presented a clear plan. Every issue connected to my address had to be corrected immediately. Ryan would be responsible for removing my home from all business registrations, resolving every legal filing, and paying all related expenses. Additional protections would also be established to prevent future misuse of my personal information. When Ryan arrived, he surprised me. There were no excuses, no arguments, no attempts to shift blame. He simply agreed. Over the next several weeks, I watched him follow through. Legal documents were corrected, business records were updated, financial counseling began. He also started therapy to address the problems he had spent years avoiding. Vanessa faced her own consequences. Once confronted with the evidence, she could no longer deny what she had done. The strain between her and Ryan became obvious, but for the first time, both of them seemed willing to face reality instead of hiding from it. Slowly, I began noticing changes. Ryan listened more than he spoke. He stopped making promises he could not keep. Most importantly, he started showing up consistently. I also established boundaries that should have existed years earlier. My finances would remain entirely under my control. No future authority over my assets would be granted. Trust would need to be earned again. Not through words, through actions. One afternoon, after another honest conversation, I offered Ryan a final opportunity to rebuild our relationship. It was not forgiveness. It was a chance. As my recovery continued, I found myself feeling something I had not experienced in months: hope. For the first time since my surgery, I allowed myself to believe that broken families, like damaged hearts, might sometimes heal if the people involved were willing to do the hard work. If you're still here with me, comment number 8 below. The path toward healing has begun, but the final chapters will reveal whether trust can truly be rebuilt and whether kindness from the past can create a legacy that changes lives forever. Now, let's move on to the conclusion of this story. Nearly 2 years passed after the day Ryan confessed the truth. By then, my physical recovery was complete. The scar on my chest had faded, and the fear that once followed every heartbeat had finally loosened its grip. More importantly, life itself had begun to feel stable again. Ryan kept his promises, not for weeks, not for months, for years. He continued attending therapy and working with financial advisors. The careless spending and risky decisions that had nearly destroyed his future slowly disappeared. Debt was reduced piece by piece. His business became smaller than before, but it became honest and sustainable. The greatest change, however, had nothing to do with money. It was his consistency. He called regularly. He visited often. He asked about my life instead of talking only about his own. For the first time in many years, I felt that he truly saw me again. Trust did not return overnight. Some wounds heal slowly, and some scars never completely disappear. But each visit, each honest conversation, and each fulfilled promise helped rebuild something that had once seemed beyond repair. Vanessa changed as well. The transformation was not immediate. Their marriage went through difficult periods as old habits collided with new realities, yet accountability slowly replaced denial. She found professional work and abandoned the endless pursuit of appearances that had once controlled so much of her life. Their lifestyle became simpler. Their relationship became healthier, and somehow, despite everything, they survived. Meanwhile, my friendship with William grew into one of the most meaningful relationships of my life. We shared meals, holidays, long conversations, and countless evenings watching the sunset over the mountains. There was never any romance between us. What connected us was something different: understanding. Two people who had experienced loss. Two people who knew what loneliness felt like. One afternoon, William formally invited me to remain at the estate permanently. He explained that I had stopped being a guest long ago. In his eyes, I was family. After thinking about it for several weeks, I accepted. The little house in Asheville had once represented safety, but now my life had expanded beyond those walls. I had found friendship, purpose, and a community that made me feel valued again. A year later, another blessing arrived. Ryan and Vanessa welcomed a daughter. They named her Sarah. The moment I held her for the first time, something inside me healed completely. She brought laughter back into our lives. Family gatherings returned. Sunday lunches became traditions again. William adored her and quickly became an honorary grandfather. Watching them together often made me smile. The family that had nearly fallen apart was functioning again. Not perfectly. No family ever does. But we were healthier, more honest, and more grateful for one another. Still, time moves forward for everyone. As the years passed, I began noticing small changes in William. He tired more easily. He occasionally missed details he once would have remembered instantly. Nothing dramatic, nothing alarming. yet enough to make me quietly worry. After everything we had survived, I finally believed the hardest chapters of my life were behind me, unaware that one final lesson still awaited us all. Several years passed peacefully before William's health finally began to fail. Age caught up with him slowly. There were more doctor appointments, more afternoons spent resting, and fewer long walks through the gardens we both loved. Yet he never complained. He accepted each new limitation with the same quiet dignity that had defined his entire life. When he passed away, it happened peacefully. I felt as though I had lost a brother. The funeral filled an entire church. Former patients, physicians, community leaders, and scholarship recipients came to honor the man who had touched so many lives. Throughout the service, Ryan remained beside me. Watching him support me without being asked reminded me how much he had changed. A few weeks later, we gathered for the reading of William's will. Several charitable gifts were announced. Trusts were established for relatives, and substantial donations were directed toward medical causes. Then came the final surprise. William had left the majority of his estate to me. I sat speechless as his attorney handed me a sealed letter. Inside, William explained that this inheritance was never about wealth. It was about trust. 4 decades earlier, a young teacher had helped a struggling medical student when nobody else would. He never forgot that kindness. He believed I would continue helping others the same way. Tears blurred my vision as I finished reading. Ryan stood quietly beside me. Neither of us needed words to understand how deeply William had changed our lives. In the years that followed, I established the Bennett Harper Foundation. The organization provided support for disadvantaged medical students and elderly people recovering from serious illnesses without family assistance. Every scholarship recipient received a handwritten note encouraging them to keep going when life became difficult. William's legacy continued through every life we touched. Looking back, I often think about Michael, Ryan, and William. Each of them shaped my journey in different ways. The greatest gift I received was never the estate William left behind. It was the reminder that a single act of kindness can travel through decades, heal broken hearts, and eventually find its way home. Life has a remarkable way of reminding us that the smallest acts of kindness often leave the deepest footprints. A moment of compassion may seem insignificant today, yet its impact can travel across years, touching lives in ways we may never fully understand. True wealth is not measured by possessions, status, or success, but by the people we help, the hope we inspire, and the love we choose to give when no one is watching. Sometimes life breaks our hearts so it can teach us what truly matters. Forgiveness does not erase pain, and trust is not rebuilt overnight, but healing becomes possible when people choose honesty, accountability, and grace. In the end, family is not simply about blood. It is about presence, loyalty, and the willingness to show up when it matters most. Thank you for spending your time with this story. If it touched your heart, please share your thoughts in the comments below. We would love to hear your perspective. Do not forget to like, subscribe, and follow the channel for more heartfelt stories that remind us of the power of kindness, resilience, and second chances.